Path of Exile 2 has been out for several weeks now. Of course, we made it our quest to find the best ways of playing Poison in Path of Exile 2, and I think we've done it. In this video, I'm going to show you guys the Frozen Plague Pathfinder. Let's get into it. So as always, a few quick caveats before we get started here. Number one, we will be playing some gameplay. This is just random gameplay. We are farming T15 to T18 maps. The gameplay above will be anywhere in that range. This build is very good at clearing AoE, very good at killing breach, and with a little bit of investment, it can be very good at boss killing. So what is the tech? So the way Poison works in POE 2 is Poison is an ailment that deals chaos damage over time. And we'll get back to that in a second because it's very different in POE 2. And it lasts 2 seconds by default, so very, very short. Damage from Poison bypasses energy shield. Fantastic. By default, physical and chaos damage from hits contribute to Poison damage. Damage does not contribute to Poison chance, so cannot be inflicted without an explicit source of Poison chance, and we'll also get into that. The base magnitude of Poison is chaos damage per second equal to 20% of the physical and chaos damage dealt by the hit that it inflicted. Also super important here at the bottom, modifiers and debuffs that affect enemies' ability to mitigate damage, such as shock, can affect the damage the enemy takes from poison. So shock is a very important element, but modifiers such as penetration has no effect. All that is super and duper important to understand, to fully understand how we're doing damage. So again, you might be thinking, Fluff, well, you're doing lightning damage, you're doing cold damage. How are you poisoning anything? Well, we're using a unique in the game called Plague Finger Gauze Wraps. This basically says all damage from hits contributes to poison magnitude. So this means fire damage, cold damage, and lightning damage can now cause poison damage. So what that allows us to do is basically pick from any number of quarterstaff attacks that we have access to. Now, again, because poison scales off of the hit, we want to do the highest damaging hit we can get our hands on. And for the quarterstaff, that ability seems to be Stormwave. If you look at the base attack damage of Stormwave, it is a 371% at level 19, which is just astronomically higher than most of the things the monk has to offer besides, Vaulting Impact, Gathering Storm, which we actually also use in this build. Falling Thunder is probably the highest damage, but it consumes power charges, which we don't want in this particular setup. And Stormwave is an ability you can cast while moving, and that is going to be super important for the Pathfinder Ascendency. What's important about Stormwave, and why Stormwave is the even better choice, is it converts 80% of your physical damage to lightning damage. Basically, you get a high phys damage roll. 80% of that 131 to 218 damage here on this quarterstaff is converted into lightning damage. You can also get added lightning damage to weapons. So between that physical damage conversion and additional lightning damage, you're doing quite a bit of lightning damage. And so you might be wondering, Fluff, how are you then freezing anything if all of your damage is lightning? Well, in Path of Exile 2, one thing that's super duper important is the ability to crowd control enemies. And right now in the current state of the game, freezing is probably the strongest way of crowd controlling enemies, making sure they can't do damage to you. So we're using what's called Call of the Brotherhood Topaz Ring. And what this allows us to do is convert all of our lightning damage into cold damage. And so if we have a really high cold hit, this allows us to have really good freeze buildup, because the harder you hit with cold damage in Path of Exile, the higher your chance of freezing the enemy. So we have a very hard hitting, lightning damage based cold hit, and a decent amount of freeze buildup on the tree and through our gear. And so we're basically freezing everything the first time we hit them. As long as they don't have ailment threshold resistance, you're going to basically freeze every enemy with one hit. Now, the other reason this is particularly good is because we're using a skill called Combat Frenzy, which says while active, anytime you freeze, pin, or electrocute an enemy, you gain a frenzy charge. So this is a fantastic way to generate charges. However, we don't want frenzy charges in this particular setup. We want power charges. So we're going to use a key passive on the skill tree called Resonance, which basically says anytime we gain frenzy charges, we instead gain power charges. And the reason that's so important is we're making brutal use of an ability called Charge Staff. Again, this is super important to understand. Gain a buff that gains 1 to 20 added quarterstaff attack lightning damage per power charge consumed. So with 3 power charges consumed, you get 3 to 60 added lightning damage. And again, why is that good? Because we convert all of our lightning into cold damage. So again, a higher hit means the higher chance mobs have to be frozen. And we're basically going to have this up with 100% uptime. It is super easy to generate charges on this build with Combat Frenzy. We freeze everything. But also, because we are converting all of our damage into cold, we no longer have a chance to apply shock, because shock is based on the lightning damage of the hit. However, there's an ability called Gathering Storm, which basically says, you charge this ability for a certain amount of time. You get this like little ping of light that indicates when you should let the skill go, and it causes you to dash and create shock ground along the path that you traveled. So the shock ground does not care about how much lightning damage you have. It is just an effect that applies shock. And again, the reason shock is so good is shock is an element that causes the enemies to take 20% increased damage in the last 4 seconds by default. So you're going to see us throw this down a lot versus bosses, a lot versus, single target rares. This is just basically a way of, for us, in this particular build, we get about 35% increased damage when they stand on this shock ground. So again, we're scaling up our hit damage with as much lightning damage, as much physical damage, as much cold damage as we can possibly muster. Because again, all of that impacts how big of a poison hit that you do. But what we're also doing on top of all of this is we're using a ring called Ming's Heart, which basically says we gain 40% of damage as extra chaos damage. So this, in essence, basically doubles the amount of poison damage we're doing to the enemy. So all that cold damage we're inflicting with the hit, we basically use 40% of that damage, and this one's corrupted, so I got 44%. But on average, 40% of that damage as extra chaos. And again, because it's chaos damage, it factors into the poison damage. But big poisons we're inflicting with this build. And the reason that's also so good is because we're using an ability called Plague Bearer, which stores up to 60% of the expected poison damage to deal a big, basically poison nova when you release it. And this damage is poison damage, straight up poison damage. And you can see in the gameplay, we charge Plague Bearer, especially in the breach, we charge Plague Bearer up like once every 2.5 seconds. Like it's back almost as soon as we use it. And this thing is nutty for clearing AoE, especially since we're a Pathfinder that uses poisonous prolif from overwhelming toxicity. So all those poisons we inflict with the big Plague Bearer, they get spread to all the targets within, 1.5 meters, I think. Yeah. And because we have a poison cap of 6, it's going to prolif really hard. And so if there's a big group of density, especially in something like Breach, they'll get hit with basically 6 Plague Bearers at one time, which is just nutty amounts of AoE damage. You might be thinking, Fluff, Ming's Heart, it is a great item, but man, that reduced global defenses, that really hurts. Reduced maximum life, that also really hurts. And I'm not gonna lie to you, the reduced maximum life does hurt. This could be countered by running, chaos inoculation, but that's not what we're really after in this particular setup. However, the reduced global defenses can be strictly countered via the passive skill tree using One with the River, 30% increased defenses while wielding a staff. So basically, by default, Ming's Heart will reduce our global defenses by at least 30, and it gets completely countered by this one node from the QuarterStaff. So you don't really have to worry about the downside other than the reduced maximum life. But even with the reduced maximum life, on this particular build, we're sitting around 1800 life as is. And because we corrupted our Ming's Heart, we're actually only getting a 24% global defense hit. So we actually get a 6% increased defenses while wielding staff. Outside of that, we're stacking copious amounts of evasion and energy shield. On this particular setup, we're probably going to easily get up to 85% evasion. We might even consider taking acrobatics, assuming we can get over about 14,000 evasion rating. That'll really help us on boss fights. And all said and done, we'll probably have around, I would say 800 energy shield. We're still missing some key passes. I'm only level 90, but we definitely want to pick up Subterfuge Mash and get ourselves a energy shield helmet. That will really help out. We'll get all to that into sort of the defensive section of this video. But let's get into all the details of the build. So first up, we're going to talk about the skill gems. Again, we are using Storm Wave. That high base attack damage is just too good to pass up. Plus, we can cast it while moving, which has some great synergy with Pathfinder. You do want to quality this thing as soon as you can because it makes this wave link a little bit more thick, so it hits more targets. It's definitely something you want to invest into with quality as soon as you can. And again, we love this ability because it converts 80% of our physical damage to lightning damage. And again, we convert that lightning damage and the cold damage to get big freeze hits. But the most important gem for this is going to be Concentrated Effect. But the most important gem you're going to get for this, and luckily it has no cost multiplier, is a skill called Concentrated Effect. This means the skills deal 40% more area damage, but the area is sort of shrunk. This basically really has no impact on the build really whatsoever, especially after you get Storm Wave quality to 20%. So basically anything that hits by the beam gets hit that much harder with Concentrated Effect. We're also going to be using Cold Infusion. Supported attacks gain 25% damage as extra cold damage. Again, the reason that's really good because that as extra applies to the poison. But with the cost of attacks deal less fire and lightning damage. And again, all of our damage gets converted into cold. So this is literally just a net positive 25% damage as extra cold damage. GG. And again, no cost multiplier. So great first two gems. Another fantastic gem for this setup is a gem called Primal Armament. Supported skills deal 25% more weapon elemental damage. That is a more multiplier. And again, basically all of our damage is going to be elemental. Primal Armament is quite good for its damage. The next gem in our setup is, it's sort of what you want it to be. You can do long shot. So that means that at range, at sort of the end of your hit here, you'll be doing a 40% or 35% damage multiplier. But of course, no extra damage in close range. And there's also close combat, which says you deal 25% more damage to enemies within 1 meter. But the only thing to note with both of these choices is that long shot has a cost multiplier of 120 and close combat has a multiplier of 140. And that is significant. This ability, Gathering Storm, does consume a lot of mana. You will be mana starved. You'll need to get mana per enemy killed, a high roll of mana per enemy killed. And we'll talk about that in the gearing section. And in fact, the cost is so high that on boss fights, I'm going to recommend you put in an inspiration. Supported skills have 40% less cost. You're probably going to need to run this on really long single target boss encounters just to keep up your mana cost. And we'll talk about the mana flask at the end. It's also super important. So yeah, up to you. If you can keep close combat, you like close combat, that's great. Long shot is probably a little bit easier to keep going in this build. But also, something to consider if you can't keep the cost multiplier for primal or long shot is comorbidity isn't a bad thing. It has 30% less poison duration. Now, the reason I don't run this all the time, I do run this on bosses sometimes. The reason I don't run it all the time is because, again, it takes away from that poison duration. This lets us get up to 8 poisons. So this is all dependent upon your attack speed. If you have really good attack speed and you can see that the boss has consistently 8 stacks of poison, then yes, comorbidity is a great choice for this setup. So if your attack speed is quite good, you'll find it pretty easy to keep up 8 stacks of poison. If your attack speed is a little bit slower and you're only getting up to like 5 or 6 poisons, comorbidity would be a really bad choice because you only want to use this if you find it easy to get up to that, 8 stacks of poison. Deadly Poison is also not necessarily great unless you're fighting a boss because it reduces the hit damage. Yes, it makes the poison damage basically deal 30% more damage, but because your hits are doing less damage, you're less likely to freeze enemies because freeze is based on the cold damage of the hit. So taking away from your hit damage, although, yes, it's going to make the poison hit harder, but you're not going to be freezing as many enemies, which is A, kind of bad for Combat Frenzy, but B, also kind of bad because it helps you CC the map and keep everything in control, but a very solid option for bosses. The last gem here in slot 6, again, I swapped this out for bosses 100% of the time, but while you're mapping, it's very, very good. Attacks gain 35% damage as cold for 3 seconds on freezing an enemy with supported skills. So again, since we're freezing basically everything with every hit, we just get a 35% damage as cold damage for 3 seconds, which again applies to our poison, which is really, really good. But on bosses, this is absolutely a dead gem. So make sure to swap to something like, Inspiration if you're struggling with mana costs, or any one of these poison gems will be very, very solid. Charge Staff, I absolutely love in this setup. There's a lot of sort of hidden tech with Charge Staff that we've sort of realized while playing with it. And some of this might even be bugged. I don't know. The one thing that I think is for sure bugged is with Charge Staff, you can use Hourglass, which says supported skills deal 40% more damage, but have a 10-second cooldown. For some reason, this doesn't add a cooldown to Charge Staff, and it only positively impacts the damage of the shockwave, giving it significantly more damage to that shockwave, which again, Shockwave is 100% of our attack damage. We basically hit twice, which is great for poison, but it gets 40% more damage just from having Hourglass linked. Again, I'm not sure that this is intended, but in a world where it does add cooldown to Charge Staff, that's totally fine because we don't have to use Charge Staff all that often. I think it probably should be adding a cooldown, but for some reason it's not. But yeah, very, very strong. But also incredibly strong is Bursting Plague. So poisons from supported skills also had 200% damage per second enemy is plague, up to a maximum of 10% enemy's max life. And then when it explodes, it deals physical damage equal to 100% of the plague on triggering the enemy. So you'll see a lot in the gameplay above that enemies are exploding when they die. And that is because the lightning damage, which is again 3 to 60 because we only have 3 power charges, basically applies a poison, and that poison damage gets stored because of our plague fingers, and it causes it to explode. So it's actually really, really good synergy between these two. We have a non-0% chance to crit. Our crit chance is not very high in this setup. I think it's somewhere around like 25%. But when we do crit with Charge Staff, and this is just passive damage, it's just a buff that goes on our weapon that we use at, plus 3 power charges. But anytime it crits, it can apply cold exposure for 8 seconds. Now, by default, cold exposure reduces the mob's resistances by 20%. And again, if we can reduce their cold res, that means our cold damage will hit higher, which in effect will make our poisons hit harder. We also run Strip Away, which means exposure applied by the supported skills has a 30% increased effect. So that basically just means our cold exposure will apply, I think, like 26 minus cold res, which is pretty nice. I think if I were to 6-link this, you could also add Glaciation to Charge Staff, which causes supported skills to have 50% more freeze buildup. So that would just be a little bit more freeze buildup from that added 60 lightning damage. But right now we're using Gathering Storm with Glaciation. But this just means every single time we use this Gathering Storm ability and it hits an elite, it'll basically 100% chance freeze them. And the reason this is also good is because we're using an anoint on our necklace called Heavy Frost, which hits ignore non-negative elemental resistance of frozen enemies. So as long as the enemy is frozen, we basically their cold res is 0. Again, if their cold res is 0, that makes our hit harder, which therein increases our poison damage. Now, by default, you sort of just hold down Gathering Storm, and as soon as you start to blink, you release it to get that sweet shock ground. And it'll also chain basically any enemy that's caught in that. We don't really use it for AoE. It is really nice on things like Ritual or things where you have a very confined space. This will sort of get you out of trouble. But we're basically going to make it even harder to use because we're using a skill gem called Window of Opportunity. This means we have a 25% shorter perfect timing window, but if we cast it when that little light pops up, we get 50% more damage when it's released. So as long as we hit it with a perfect amount of timing still, basically right when he pops back into the stance, right when he pops back is when you want to release it. This can get kind of hard to do because if you miss it, it's kind of just it's not a bad move if you miss it, but we're definitely only using this for that shock ground and for a hard poison hit. But yeah, that just gives it more damage. We're also giving it momentum because the idea is you travel at least 2 meters with this skill. And if we do that, we get 40% more damage. Bing, bang, boom, already at 90% more damage as long as we cast it in that perfect timing window, and as long as we travel at least 2 meters from it. Pretty nutty amount of poison damage being dealt. I also really like close combat on this. I think close combat works 100% of the time because the time of which it hits is you're close to the enemy. So it's not that it calculates the damage as you're casting it. It calculates the damage as you hit the enemy. So this will always be up. So this is, again, a 25% more damage multiplier for the skill. What I also like on Gathering Storm is, Glaciation until I probably get a 6-link Charge Staff and put Glaciation on Charge Staff. I like Glaciation on Gathering Storm, which basically says, as long as I hit with this ability, I'm going to freeze because the amount of damage it does is nutty. If you're getting another link on Gathering Storm, you could put something like Frost Nexus if you kept Glaciation on, which says supported skills create chilled ground for 4 seconds when they freeze an enemy. Because this will absolutely freeze anything that it touches, it's going to create that chilled ground, which is pretty nice again for CC. Another thing you can do is add martial tempo. That will speed up the abilities just a little bit, so it's less time you spend in the animation of the skill. That's kind of nice. Another thing you can do, and which I probably will do eventually, is put Unbreakable on it. This just makes it so if enemies were to hit you while you're charging the ability, because one of the worst things that can happen with this ability is you start to charge it up and then you get hit or you get stunned or you get interrupted, and it like sort of breaks your rhythm. And so Unbreakable will basically give you double stun threshold while you're casting the ability, which is really nice. I actually currently use that on Plague Bearer, which we'll talk about in just a second. And speaking of Plague Bearer, first and foremost, levels on this thing are the most important thing you can get for it. It's just like Plague Bearer from Path of Exile 1. The more gem levels you can get on it, the better. So immediately support this thing with Chaos Mastery. It's +1 level of Chaos supporter skills, because again, every single level will increase that stored poison damage. It's also a physical and a chaos. So another thing you can do right out of the gate is give a +1 level of physical skills. So that gives us +2 gem levels right out of the box. You also want to get this thing with as much quality as you can, because it stores even more chaos damage or poison damage. I like to put on Magnified Effect. That just makes it so it hits a way bigger AoE when you decide to use it. 40% more area of effect. And again, because I'm usually within a bunch of mobs, a bunch of dangerous enemies when I'm casting Plague Bearer, I like to put Unbreakable on it just so I can't get stunned, because if you get interrupted while you're trying to cast it, it doesn't have the fastest cast time ever. And it also really can't be sped up by anything but skill speed. So it's just a nice thing to have, so you don't get like sort of ruined in a big AoE when you're surrounded by enemies. You can also add Expanse to the skill. This will basically give it a +6 cooldown, but for 50% more area effect. But I find that it comes back so fast, it's kind of a net negative for the skill, so I don't love Expanse on it. Another thing you could do if you're using Unbreakable on your Gathering Storm, which again I probably plan on doing, is you could use Wind Wave on it. So if you get stunned while casting it, it'll knock anything back and give you a chance to cast it again. Again, Unbreakable would be better, but if we're already using it in another skill, Wind Wave is a good second option. For other skills, we are using Grim Feast. This thing is OP in the current state of the game. We actually have this qualityed up as well, because every single time you kill something, it's going to put like a little soul over their body. And if you just walk into that little soul, you get 70 energy shield. And again, because we are an evasion/energy shield build, this is super duper strong. So quality this thing up as fast as you can, because it is juicy. I have a little bit of extra spirit all said and done, so I can socket in a precision. Again, because Gathering Storm is sort of a ranged ability, and we do use long shot a lot of the time, this can just be pretty nice to have. I also, again, because I have a little bit of extra spirit, I can socket a clarity in it. And again, each of these cost 10. My total spirit pool is about 140, which I'm able to sort of reserve for all of these. Again, mana regeneration is super important. Mana, you will be a little starved. So this clarity helps a lot. It goes a long way. But yeah, Grim Feast, OP. We're using Ghost Dance. Again, because we are an evasion/energy shield build, Ghost Dance is incredibly powerful. Basically, every single time when we're hit, we consume a Ghost Shroud to recover energy shield based on 5% of our evasion. Because our evasion is, again, so stinking high on this particular setup, we have 10,000 at least right now, and we're going to get way more. We're not even fully done with our gear. So yeah, super duper strong to recover energy shield when we're hit. Fast Forward is a free gem. You can link with it. It's absolutely a must have. This basically means the support skills have 30% less skill duration, which means we get Ghost Shrouds that much faster, 30% faster than 3.2 seconds. It's just a net positive, and it costs nothing. So absolutely socket that right away. Dark Effigy is just a totem we pop down on bosses. This is how we're generating Wither. It's just a nice thing to do. There's a lot of ways to apply Wither. You could, have a bow in your offhand, do Rain of Arrows with Withering Hit. We just found this to be sort of a nice way to passively generate Wither while still doing other sources of damage. Because again, we do have several things we want to be casting here between, Hand of Cheula, Gathering Storm, Stormwave, Plague Nova. There's plenty of things to be casting, so I just like popping down a totem that applies Wither. Arcane Tempo, this makes it shoot out the projectiles faster and more frequently, so higher chances of getting more stacks of Wither. It also lets us cast the skill faster, which is great. Font of Rage is really nice, because if you put down the totem, it basically generates 2 rage for you per second. You can see here, we're gonna plop it down, and then up here, you're gonna see our rage start stacking up. So as long as we're in the radius, we're gonna get that bonus. You're usually not fighting in the radius of your totem though, because you wanna sort of like put the totem off to the side so that no one sees it. But in the case that you do, it's just, it's just damage. It's more attack damage. Why not? You can also put faster projectiles on Dark Effigy. It makes it sort of cast the projectiles faster. Again, more stacks of Wither. Another thing that can be really nice to do is Ancestral Urgency. 80% increased total totem play speed, so it just makes you pop down the totem even that much faster. And then lastly, Font of Mana is also sort of a really nice means of getting mana back while you're casting your other skills. It'll just increase the amount of mana you get. You can see if you're not in range of it, you don't get it. But if you are in range of it, it sort of increases your mana. This can actually be really nice to do when you're out of mana on a boss, which does happen sometimes. Maybe you misuse your mana flasks. This can be a quick way to, sort of top back off. Last but not least, because we are using a quarterstaff, we get access to an ability called Hand of Cheula, which is really quite good. Basically, it's an instant dash to the target, and we apply any curses and marks we have linked to Hand of Cheula. So this is just a one-button way to apply our curses and apply our marks. Now, by default, Hand of Cheula is barely usable, but we're going to show you guys when we get into the passive skill tree ways of making Hand of Cheula really, really potent and definitely worth using on any boss fights. But we'll get into that in the sort of the skill tree section. But we're using Hand of Cheula to apply Despair. Keep this Despair at level 9, level 10, because the int requirements start to really pop off on Despair. And your immediate question, why are you using Despair instead of Frostbite, the curse that reduces cold resistance? Because again, one, we're applying cold exposure on hit through Charged Staff, which again, I think is around like a 26% cold res loss. But if they're frozen, we're also using Heavy Frost, so enemy hits ignore non-negative elemental resistance. So Heavy Frost would be rendered useless if we had Frostbite curse. And so this basically makes it so, one, our Plague Nova hits that much harder because it is a chaos hit, but also our Ming's Heart hits will hit that much harder to enemies affected by Despair. Now, again, Despair does not affect the poison dot damage like it did in Path of Exile 1. You would essentially double dip Despair. That's not how it works in PoE 2. So don't go thinking that juicing your chaos damage will make you do more poison damage, because that's not how it works in this game. But it will affect the damage that Ming's Heart does and the damage that Plague Nova does. We're also using Heightened Curse to get 25% increased effect of the supported curses, so we're going to get that much more minus chaos res from Despair. And then we're finally using Freezing Mark. This is really good. Hits against the enemy cause 50% more freeze buildup. And again, we are stacking loads of freeze buildup in this build. We'll get to that in the passive skill tree section. And you want to qual this thing as soon as you can, because again, it gives 20% more freeze buildup on top of the base 34. So 54% more freeze buildup against the target. This can be nice. You actually will freeze bosses, and that's really great for windows of damage, because again, we are using Heavy Frost. And I think last, I don't have a 5 link yet for Hand of Cheula, but Persistence would be super key to just get these curses to last that much longer. Would be absolutely fantastic. 40% more duration on these, because we don't want to cast Hand of Cheula ever. And we're going to talk about the weapon swap tech that we're using here to make those curses last longer. But we just don't want to be casting that skill like ever. So reapplying it sucks. And Hand of Cheula is a really slow, weird skill in this setup. The less amount of time we can passing Hand of Cheula, because we have way better things to be casting, the better. Moving on to the passive section of the skill tree. Things to keep in mind is we're all about ailments. Ailments in Path of Exile is, chill, freeze, shock, poison. So anything that affects ailments is a net positive for the build. Anything that impacts evasion and energy shield is a net positive build, because we are an evasion, energy shield based build. We're also elemental damage. So anything that's elemental damage or attack damage or melee damage, all these things are net positives for the build. And you'll see that in the skill tree. Now, first off, on Ranger, we're going to pick up some movement speed and evasion rating. Movement speed is hard to come by in this game. So this plus 8% movement speed right at the start is really strong, especially while leveling. Increased evasion rating through this side of the tree as well. Super duper strong. Coming down into both of these evasion nodes are going to be very strong. And again, a little bit more movement speed here. Super duper OP. We're basically want to rush the poison nodes. We're going to get a +1 poison here. That makes it so we can go from 1 poison to 2. And then lastly, toxins. Increased poison duration is going to be super important, because we're basically going to be reducing our own poison duration through a lot of these nodes and through Pathfinder. From there, I'd rush into the second poison option, so we can apply 3 poisons, but a cost of 25% reduced poison duration. This makes it so we have +3 poisons. And then as a Pathfinder, once you get overwhelming toxicity, that means you can have +6 poisons. Also going to want to pick up escalating toxins. We get increased poison duration for each poison we've inflicted recently. So this is basically like a ramp time for our poison duration, which is really, really strong on bosses. So as long as you poison it once every 4 seconds, you get this juicy poison duration. After that, pick up the rest of the poison nodes. Increase magnitude of poisons, recover 2% life on killing a poison enemy. Super duper strong for mapping. And then lastly, crippling toxins. 25% chance to maim on hit against poison enemies. That's kind of whatever. We are a ranged build, so it is nice. But more importantly, 25% increased magnitude of poisons you inflict. Now, what's also important with these poison nodes is you get poison on hit chance. You get poison on chance here, poison on hit chance here, poison on hit chance here. And between that and our jewels, which is the most important part of any really poison build in Path of Exile, on these jewel sockets, you'll see we have, increased chance to inflict ailments, increased chance to inflict poison. This is how we get our skill up to 100% chance to poison on hit without the gem that gives you a 60% chance to poison on hit, because that is just a loss of a gem link. This is how we make up our poison hit chance. So you're going to see on every single one of these jewels, we have things like 1, attack speed with QuarterStaff is great, increased accuracy, net positive, but magnitude of ailments we inflict. Again, ailments is shock, chill, freeze, poison. So it's not just one thing. Ailments is just net positive. Duration of ailments. Really, really nice. Now this jewel, we have attack damage, poison on hit, magnitude of ailments, duration of damaging elements, all positives for the build. Attack speed with QuarterStaff, chance to inflict ailments. This is additive again with all of your ailments. Magnitude of damage will have an active charm. Poison chance to inflict ailments, magnitude of poisons, magnitude of ailments, all positive things. Evasion rating, great thing. Chance of poison on hit, magnitude of ailments, crit. It's not a net negative for the build. So you're going to see, this one has freeze buildup, great. Magnitude of poisons, duration of poison, all really good. So there's a lot of good things you can get on jewels, but more importantly, you want to make sure you get your poison chance up to 100%. That is the most important thing. That is the most important thing you can do for your ability to get this main hand chance to poison up to over 100%. We have just at 101. It is going to carry you. And so for this particular setup, we have like what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6 jewels in this build. And again, the jewels are really, really strong. Probably the most strong thing you get on the skill tree. After that, you do want to think about your defenses on this character. Going through this dex node is really, really strong because we are hybrid. So we want to stack dex, we want to stack int, a little bit of strength. Like we need like 25 strength for this build as well. So these are really nice nodes to pick up, and it's on your way to get these really crazy good defensive nodes. This one, 100% increased evasion rating from your body armor. And you can get like, 1,600, 1,800 evasion on the body armor. This one has 1,300, but 250 max life. So super strong node. We also combine that with a node called Spectral Ward, which gives us max ES per 12 evasion rating on armor. So that's a really good synergy with all these evasion nodes. Really good synergy with having a high evasion base on your chest. Another strong node here, Catalysis. 20% increased elemental damage with attacks. Again, more hit damage, more poison damage, but also 5% damage taken from hits is taken as a random element. This is really, really strong because again, we are going to be res capped. Res capped in this build is a little tricky because we are using 2 unique rings, and that is a really big defensive slot in Path of Exile 2. So you're really going to have pretty great gear on your boots, belt, chest, and helmet to sort of make up for those reses, plus an amulet. Plus you're using a unique pair of gloves, so it's also another skill slot wasted. So 3 uniques in this build, that's a lot. So it's going to be tough. Eventually, we're probably going to have to get to the point where our gear is so good that we can get this chaos res up through maybe ultimatum runes. But yeah, I'd say chaos res is probably the biggest weakness of this build right now. And not being able to sort of get resistances from our gloves or rings is really sort of challenging, but we're going to get through it eventually. But from here on out, you're going to see sort of these orange nodes and green nodes. Now, orange nodes means, these are the things we're using basically full time in this setup, and the green nodes are like the special big brain min-max weapon swap technology that we use. But for these orange nodes, again, 99% of the time is what we're using. Increased duration of damaging elements on enemies, so this makes our poison duration that much better. But also increased damage with hits against enemies affected by elements. This is any element, so chill, freeze, shock, poison, always going to be up. So 30% increased damage, and all these nodes along the way are very, very strong. We get magnitude, and again, magnitude increases how much chill we apply, increases how much shock we apply, increases how much damage we do with our poison. So ailments is net positive. We're also picking up Vile Wounds, 33% increased damage with hits enemies affected by elemental ailments. Everything's going to be chilled 100% of the time, so will always be up. Another really good node for this ability, or for this build, is called Blinding Strike. 24% increased attack damage, but 10% chance to blind enemies. Blind enemies basically reduces their evasion rating and it makes them less accurate, so they're going to hit you less. So if you have high evasion rating, this is very, very strong. So we do in this build. So blind on hit is really good. We're also picking up this little node, increased attack damage. Again, attack damage is flat W because it increases the hit damage, which in turn increases our poison damage. But also, again, one of the rarest sources of movement speed in Path of Exile 2. We get 2% increased movement speed here on this tree. And again, down here, we get skill speed and 3% increased movement speed. Skill speed is basically attack speed, but better. And then some of the strongest nodes on the tree, we get this QuarterStaff nodes here. One, knock back enemies when they get crits. This is a nice way to tell if you've crit anything. And again, because we are sort of a ranged build, this is a net W for the build. But more importantly, we get freeze build up, freeze build up, freeze build up, plus increased defenses while wielding staff, which basically cancels out the net negative of Ming's Heart. So very, very strong with this build, plus a bunch of freeze buildup, which is what we're all about. Coming down here, we get this easy 25 dex, accuracy ratings with attacks with quarterstaffs, also net W, crit damage bonus, net W. We don't crit a lot, but when we do, it's going to do better. So yeah, super strong quarterstaff stuff down there. And you can see the full skill tree and the link below, but we definitely want to pick up Subterfuge Mask later on to get even more defensive stats through the use of a full ES helmet. You can get like a 300 ES helmet, and that would be like 600 evasion rating. So very, very strong that we want to get eventually. Going into the big brain tech of these green nodes. So we're using Weapon Swept technology in Path of Exile 2 to basically swap to Weapon Swap 2 and get these crazy curse nodes. So as long as we have, all we care about is having a weapon and a weapon slot 2 that has good attack speed. That just makes Hand of Chelula attack a little bit faster. But we don't care about the stats on it whatsoever. We don't care about how much damage Hand of Chelula is doing. It is just to apply our debuffs. And so when we swap to Weapon Slot 2 to cast Hand of Chelula, we're getting all of these additional nodes, which are just insane. So we get enemies that are marked have 15% reduced accuracy rating, 50% increased effect of our mark skills. Marks have 60% skill effect duration. Enemies that you mark cannot deal crits. So just as long as the boss is marked, they cannot crit you, which is absolutely bonkers fantastic. And if the boss summons any ads, those ads will be blinded. Enemies marked by you take 10% increased damage. Culling Strike against enemies you mark, also really, really good. And then finally, we come up and get this Cursed Duration tree. Just makes our despair just last that much longer. Plus, enemies cursed by us cannot regen Energy Shield, which is great for bosses with phases. They don't get their ES back. But also, enemies cursed by you have 50% reduced life regeneration. This could be really nice on sort of some of those long boss fights. So again, weapon swap tech is GG. This makes it so you don't have to cast Hand of Chelula all that often, and the curses just stay up. Really, really strong stuff with weapon swapping here. But as far as Ascendency goes, we are a Pathfinder. I'm not even fully ascended yet. I am just no good at Sanctum or Trial of Secumus. And I really don't enjoy doing it. So we're missing our last Ascendency here. We'll probably get it sooner than later. Obviously, with your first easy 4 points, you're going to pick up Contagious Contamination and Overwhelming Toxicity. This is super nice. Yes, you can get this as a buff for the cost of 30 Spirit, but this just gives it to you for free. It's basically Poison Prolif. And because of these two things combinate, we get the effect of basically 6 Plague Novas on any sort of density, which is just insane. On top of, obviously Gathering Storm, poisoning things and doing a lot of poison damage. We also really like Running Assault because we can use Gathering Storm while moving. 30% less movement speed while using skills while moving is actually really nice. This can sort of help you, have better damaging windows on bosses, like less time that you can basically not be casting stuff while moving. This is just a net positive. Really, really strong. I think for the last points, I've played enough of the game to understand that, yeah, it would be nice to be immune to slows, but you can kind of tell when you're going to be slowed. So just as long as you're not standing on like chilled ground, you'll probably be able to avoid it. So I'm probably going to pick up Traveler's Wisdom. This is just 6 more passive skill points, and passive skill points in this particular tree is really strong because there's not a lot of things that are bad. So for example, with just 6 points, we can get all of these nodes. So we could get increased melee damage, increased attack speed, 8% increased attack speed, and then going into 25% increased melee range, 10% increased melee damage. Like just 6 points right here alone would be probably a net gain of, who knows, like 20% more damage. So I do think that Traveler's Wisdom will be my last setup here. But if I find that like, oh, you know what, slow is really cucking the build, then we could switch to that instead of the 6 points. But I think 6 points will be the way. You could also go into connected chemistry if you just want to heal through basically anything that's bad in this game. This will give you the flash charges to do it. But we're not set up in this build really for flash charges and like maximizing that node. So I think Traveler's Wisdom will be the way. Going into the gear, this is super duper important in Path of Exile, and actually really, really important when it comes to the weapon in particular. Now, again, big brain stuff happening here with damage conversion. So the most important things you're going to want on a weapon. Again, this weapon is not very good, but we were able to do all the content with it because it has some really important stats that we're after. Number 1 is a high physical damage roll. Again, because we are converting 80% of our physical damage to lightning, the higher you can get on a physical damage roll, the better. This is only a T3, but again, that damage is converted to lightning, and that lightning is converted to cold. So a really good physical damage roll is tier 1. Tier 2 would be a really, really good lightning damage roll. This one's T6. It's okay. Again, this weapon is not that great. And then lastly, a cold damage roll, because cold damage is straight up cold damage. So all 3 of these contribute towards getting a big cold damage hit because we're using the Call of the Brotherhood Topaz Ring. So those prefixes are super duper important. As far as suffixes are concerned, because we are a poison ability, or a poison build, and we want to apply many stacks of poison, attack speed is an important role, I think, but also incredibly important for quality of life with the build is mana per kill. A high mana per kill roll, ideally. This makes mapping silky dilky smooth. A 43 mana roll, I think that's it's a T8. Man, it makes mapping so much better. You can run without mana per kill, but you'll be spamming your mana flask probably most of the time. And that's fine because you get mana flask really fast as you're killing trash. But for me, the mana per kill is just GG. I might even recommend like having one without mana per kill for like boss fights and having something that's more useful. But right now it's very good. One thing that's not great, we played around with Leech's mana because we're converting, again, 80% of our physical damage into lightning damage. Our physical hit is actually very low, like very, very low, abysmal damage. So leeching the physical damage as mana is basically nothing. This is sort of a dead stat. So I think if anything I could have here, I would have base crit. I think would be a way more effective. That would increase the crit chance of our Gathering Storm, which would help us apply cold exposure more often. So I think the best in slot would be increased physical damage, added lightning damage, added cold damage, mana on kill, increased attack speed, and base crit. I think that would be a GG. And then you could even have one that didn't have mana on kill and had crit damage for something like bosses. I think that would be 100% best in slot. For Plague Fingers, you cannot control what this rolls. So just try to get a good poison on hit chance. Try to get high attack speed. Maybe you can corrupt something even better. Socket it with whatever. Make sure you socket it before you corrupt it. But yeah, socket it with something you can roll. Again, we're using Call of the Brotherhood Topaz Ring. You can corrupt this thing to, I guess, get more stats. And that's what I've done here. So I get, more freeze buildup than normal. I get more lightning damage converted to cold damage, so 11% more, which is pretty crazy. You also get more mana regen and more int, which we didn't really land here, but very, very strong if you can corrupt this to get additional effects, but very important for the build. Again, this is basically what the build revolves around. That and Ming's Heart. Ming's Heart, again, you can also seemingly corrupt it past what it's giving. So this one has a base 30 to 40% damage is extra chaos, and I've corrupted it to be 44, which is great. And it comes with a minimum 30% global reduced defenses, and I've corrupted this to be less. So that's really, really good. The reduced maximum life cannot seem to be touched. So that's something to take into consideration. But The implicit of Chaos Res is really, really strong. You're going to want to get Chaos Res capped eventually. I'm going to have to solve for that. We are using sort of an Amethyst charm, but for those times that we don't have Amethyst charm up, we can get one hit by big chaos damage hits. So do keep that in mind. As far as other pieces go, because we are using unique gloves, unique rings, resistances are going to be key on some of these other pieces of gear. So a helmet eventually, because we're going to want to use that subterfuge mask, or we're going to want a pure ES helmet. But this is nice in the meantime, something with higher life, good resistances. I like a little bit of intelligence, maybe on one of your pieces of gear, because again, getting a high int roll, you're going to have high int to level up some of these gems. So you're going to need to get probably int somewhere. A helmet's a great slot to do it. I think best in slot would be a pure ES helmet, with something like 250 plus energy shield, but good life roll, solid resistance rolls, whatever gets you to that 75 cap. And then eventually, hopefully dropping the rune here for like a chaos rune from Ultimatum and getting chaos res. Same thing with chess, crazy high evasion, really good life roll, really good resistance rolls. I don't know, it might always be best in slot to run sort of increased armor and evasion on chest, because you get such good value from evasion on chest from bestial skin, but also spectral ward. So maybe we can't run chaos resistance runes here. We'll have to see. The belt, again, charm slots are going to be super important, but res rolls and a life roll, very, very important as well. Boots, getting movement speed is king here. Obviously, I kind of think that GGG to make it so that boots just have an implicit of movement speed. I think having a guaranteed stat, or else it's trash on any item slot, is sort of bad game design. So hopefully that gets changed later on. But right now, you want boots with at least 30% movement speed, a good life roll, good resistance rolls, hopefully something with a charm slot so you can get chaos res from Ultimatum. And then amulet, also a super duper important slot here, because this is how we're able to make up some spirit, because we don't want to use any spirit rolls on our chest. Only going to need 20 spirit here, but getting additional will help you a lot, because it helps you sort of reserve like clarity, like we said, precision, really, really strong for this build. But as far as other things you're looking for, obviously life roll, because we have to sort of counter Ming's heart negative effect. Life is going to be really important. Resistances are going to be really important and hard to come by. And then for that anoint, getting heavy frost, it's not as much damage as I was really hoping it would be, but it is still a net positive because we are only using Despair Curse and we're not using Frostbite. So I do think it's good. It doesn't have a lot of potential on bosses, and it's not that expensive. It's Fear, Despair, Paranoia, which are pretty early oils. I don't know what they're calling those things. Emotions, distilled emotions. But obviously something like Pure Chaos would probably be better. Damage is actually chaos. Maybe even Essence of the Mountain. Damage is actually cold with freeze buildup. Another one that could be really easy to spec early on, this is like basically free, is to get pressure points, which is, stun buildup and freeze buildup, both positive things for the build. Another thing that could be really potentially awesome would be the spiral into insanity. Increased chaos damage and increased global defenses. This would again sort of help counter the Ming's heart and give us better damage from Ming's heart, but it is, pretty costly. And again, for that weapon swap technology, just want to make sure you have something with attack speed on your offhand so that Chelula will use that attack speed when it's casting. But we don't care about the damage on the offhand whatsoever. As far as charms and potions are concerned, I really like things that either increase the chart. Obviously, amount recovered, I think, is best in slot for any potion flask. So I think that can get up to like 80 to 100%. So look out for those rolls. Increased charges or reduced charges used are key, because you're really only going to want these on bosses. It's seemingly the only time you cast potions, at least in this build, because you get recovery on kill from poison. And again, you're going to be kind of mana starved here. So do swap to, other skill gems when you're fighting bosses. Inspiration can be really, really vital when you're fighting bosses. Mana is an issue in this build. But as far as charms, I think the best in slot here is Stone Charm, so that we can be cured from stunned. I think anything that's like increased duration and increased charges gained, so we get those charges back, is really strong. Anything that's like gain a charge on kill, really strong. So Frozen and stunned. Cure those immediately. I think these are the 2 best in slot for mapping. And then until we get our chaos res up, we're sort of, I feel like, forced into using this. This gives us more chaos res if we've been hit by a chaos recently. But the only negative downside of this is we have to get hit with the chaos hit first. So if a big initial chaos damage hit hits us, then we're sort of really struggling because we only have 22% chaos res. So we do need to get this up just to be more consistent. The build is very tanky, but you'll notice like when you take chaos damage, it's very noticeable. It's not like POE 1 where you can kind of get away with having like mid chaos res. Like I think you're going to need it in this game pretty heavily. For playing the build, it's pretty simple. You know, you just go in, start using Storm Wave to freeze things. You'll get your power charges. Once you get 3 power charges, you want to use those. You see an elite, you want to use your QuarterStaff to charge in there. Make sure he gets frozen. If he gets frozen, all of his resistances get stripped away. And then you just like go to town on him. Cast Plague Nova basically anytime you want because it comes back almost immediately. Again, see an elite here. We use our Gathering Storm to get him frozen. GG, he's dead. Get more power charges, spend those power charges. You can use Gathering Storm to sort of get out of trouble as well, like things like Ritual, where you're sort of locked into one singular place. It can sort of get you out of jail. But really just spam Plague Nova really as much as you want. You want it to be fully charged to 100% before you use it because it's more potent that way. But no reason to really sit on it because it does, again, it comes back so fast because of the amount of pro lift we're doing in this setup. That's really it. I mean, you're not really casting Hand of Cheula in maps. You're only casting on bosses. You don't really need that additional damage between the, you know, increased shock damage you're getting from Gathering Storm, like right here. Boom, he's hit with that shock. 34% increased damage taken. Plus, because he's frozen, all of his resistances get stripped. Really GG. We don't cast the totem. We don't cast Hand of Cheula inside of maps because it's not really needed. Well, that's basically going to do it for the video. I really wanted to get this out to you before I sort of leave for, you know, family vacation for the next week. But if you have any questions, you can join my Discord. You can come over to Twitch, ask your questions there. Hopefully this build helps you guys, you know, enjoy Path of Exile 2 as much as I've been enjoying Path of Exile 2. This game is fantastic. Can't wait to see more. As always, guys, like, subscribe, and come over to Twitch. Ask your questions. We love you guys. Peace out.